Have you ever looked at a map of Africa and just wondered about all those straight lines? I mean, they look so unnatural. Well, that's because that map, it wasn't really designed by Africans. It was inherited. Today, we're going to dig into how the colonial past literally drew the borders of modern Africa, and how that legacy is still shaping its politics, its conflicts, and its very identity today. Let's trace how those lines on a map became a continent's reality. I mean, wow. This metaphor, it just perfectly captures the attitude of European powers back in the late 19th century. The scramble for Africa, as it's called, wasn't some slow, organic thing. No, it was a frantic, competitive gold rush. Empires were scrambling to claim the biggest and best slices of the continent, with almost zero regard for the people or the cultures that were already there. So, here's the crucial point. The whole partition of Africa, which its creators thought would be permanent for their empires, ended up being permanent in a way they never, ever imagined. It imposed what our source here calls a steel grid of territories that became the absolute foundation for the modern African state system. And this is where it gets really wild. Think about it. Colonial rule itself was a pretty short blip in the grand scheme of African history, less than a century in most places. But the states it created, those have been incredibly durable. In fact, most African nations today, they don't have a direct pre-colonial version of themselves. They are entirely products of this very short, very intense period. And this number, this says it all. By 1990, that colonial grid had chopped the continent up into 52 separate sovereign countries. That's nearly a third of the entire United Nations. But this fragmentation, it came with a huge cost. So many of these new states were small, they had limited resources, which made them economically vulnerable on the world stage from the moment they were born. All right, so building on that, let's zoom in on the first major legacy of colonialism, the borders themselves. And this leads to a really fascinating paradox that completely defined the early years of African independence. Seriously, think about this for a second. The very nationalist movements that fought for freedom saw these borders as these hated, illegitimate symbols of colonial oppression. Their dream was pan-African unity. Yet almost immediately after they got independence, these same artificial lines were locked in place. They became almost sacred. So why? What happened? Well, the answer comes down to this legal principle called uti possidestis. It basically means as you possess. You see, Africa's new leaders were faced with this terrifying possibility of just endless continent-wide wars to redraw the entire map. So they made a really pragmatic choice. The Organization of African Unity, the OAU, wrote the territorial integrity of existing states right into its charter. Basically, to keep the peace, they all agreed to accept the borders they inherited, effectively turning the colonial cage into their new home. Of course, the colonial legacy wasn't just about lines on a map. It was also about the continued influence of European powers on their former colonies, long after the flags came down. And, that influence looked very, very different depending on who the colonizer was. And you can see a massive contrast right here. Britain's role? It largely faded over time. The Commonwealth became more of a friendly club for discussion than a real tool of power. But France was a totally different story. It stayed deeply, actively involved. It set up currency zones, held regular summits with African leaders, and kept permanent military bases, often intervening to protect its allies. It really remained a dominant power in the region. This quote from Ivory Coast's first president really helps explain why that French connection was so strong. You see, unlike in other empires, Francophone African leaders were deeply integrated into the French political system itself. Some had even been ministers in Paris. This created this incredibly close, personal bond, a fraternity that has lasted for decades. But this colonial legacy, it has a much, much darker side. We can draw a direct, undeniable line from specific decisions made during decolonization, decisions often driven by the interests of the colonizers, to some of Africa's most tragic and long-running conflicts. Let's start with Southern Africa. The source material here argues that so much of the region's immense suffering can be traced back to a single, catastrophic mistake made by Great Britain. Back in 1910, Britain didn't hand power to the majority population. No, it gave it to an exclusively white minority government. That single act paved the road to apartheid. And that apartheid regime then became this force of immense destruction, waging wars and sponsoring insurgencies in its neighbors like Angola and Mozambique, all to protect its own racist system. The result was decades of violence that engulfed the entire region.
And you see a really similar, tragic story of outside interests causing local disaster up in the Horn of Africa. Here, the strategic calculations of the Cold War completely steamrolled the wishes of the people on the ground.
So check this out. In 1952, the United Nations, with a lot of influence from the United States, decided to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia. The result was a brutal 30-year war for independence, one of the longest and deadliest conflicts in African history. So as we start to pull all this together, it becomes crystal clear that Africa's colonial inheritance is just deeply, deeply complicated. It's a legacy of profound division and, paradoxically, a powerful new kind of unity. It's really this double-edged sword. On one side, you have the shadow, a system of weak, artificial states and that lingering influence of former empires. But, and this is the incredible part, that shared experience of being colonized also created a powerful foundation for solidarity. This solidarity then found its voice in a massive, transcendent cause, the fight against colonialism and racism. And that became the great unifying principle of the OAU and the very bedrock of the Pan-African dream. And that really just leaves us with this one final thought. Those lines drawn on a map in some European capital over a century ago, they weren't just lines. They were the seeds of nations, the sources of conflict, and the foundation of a shared identity. They're just a powerful, powerful reminder of how the decisions of the past keep echoing on, shaping the destiny of an entire continent and its people, even today.